I'd like to perhaps move on to our last speaker, Dr. Paul Poteat, who is Professor of Counseling, Developmental, and Educational Psychology at Boston College, who will be sharing his important work on resilience and flourishing among LGBTQ youth. So Paul, please share with us your slides and take it away.
Thank you.
We don't yet see your slides, Paul.
Oh.
It says you've started screen sharing.
Am I back on?
We can see you. We don't see your screen share yet.
Okay, let me try one more time. I think it crashed for a moment. Is this now showing?
It's saying that you're, oh, now we see it. And now we see the your slides, but it's not in presenter view yet.
Let me just pressing one more button. Is that working?
Perfect.
Oh, wonderful. So thank you again. And what a thought-provoking and energizing session this has been. And I just feel very grateful to be a part of it and also to share some research on behalf of some amazing colleagues who are doing work in this area that's beginning to focus on flourishing among queer youth. And while some of the points that I'll raise in this talk apply across many contexts, some of the examples that I'll draw from will be situated in particular within the school context itself. And while the spirit of my discussion really does focus on flourishing, I feel like it's essential for us to continue to name and respond to the ongoing acts of discrimination that many queer youth are experiencing both within and outside of school. As Kate shared in her presentation, we've seen a wave of anti-queer legislation being passed across many states that are erasing queer identities, discussion of queer issues and queer people. And it's essential that we remain focused on that as well. And the reason that I start a conversation on flourishing with a recognition of adversity and discrimination is because for queer youth, their experiences of adversity and flourishing are often co-occurring as opposed to being experienced separately. And so as we go on to consider what flourishing looks like for queer youth, it's essentially impossible for us to do that without recognizing how that interfaces with oppression and discrimination that is still very much a part of their lives and development. With that recognition, there has been extension of research to focus on how queer youth are resilient, even in the face of adversity, especially when they're supported by their peers, by adults who are in their lives, and by supportive context and settings and systems. And much of this work has begun to show how factors such as peer support or adult mentoring can buffer the effects of discrimination on otherwise negative mental health and developmental outcomes among queer youth. And while this has also been an important expansion upon historically research looking at health disparities and documenting health disparities, we've now seen an even greater movement and momentum to consider thriving and outright flourishing among queer youth. And it's here where I'd like to begin unpacking this work. And I'd like to suggest some ways in which we could advance work in this field. And for that, we might ask first, why would we study flourishing among queer youth? Again, recognizing the adversity that continues to be experienced among many queer young people. One of those reasons is because with our attention to health disparities, and even with our attention to the absence of health disparities, that is insufficient in and of itself to capture how queer youth find meaning and purpose and value in their lives. And by attending to additional indicators of flourishing and positive development, we begin to have a much richer and arguably much more holistic account of how queer youth persevere, how they gain strength and thrive throughout development. And we might ask, as we turn to look at indicators of positive development for queer youth, what might some of those be? And one source that we might draw on is from positive psychology. And this is most certainly a non-exhaustive list of some of those indicators that we might consider, such as joy and creativity and humor and gratitude and a sense of purpose. In fact, scholars have pointed to hope in particular as crucial to be examining among young people who are experiencing oppression and marginalization, and have framed hope as a means to heal from discrimination. And hope itself can often be described as a positive orientation to the future, feeling that you can identify goals for yourself. Not only can you identify goals, but you can see how to reach them and the pathways that you can pursue to achieve goals. And importantly, feeling that you have the ability to take those steps and to achieve those goals. Likewise, there's been work showing that self-compassion and a sense of authenticity and being able to bring and show your true self to others underlies well-being for queer youth. And finally, a sense of humor. And I guess I'll just pause here to say, who among us would not want to be in a focus group with queer youth discussing their sense of humor? I think that we have missed so much of queer young people's lives while not looking at some of these indicators of positive development. I'll also point here with the example of humor, as well as with the earlier example for hope, that these are not untethered or disconnected from queer youth's experiences of discrimination. It would be inaccurate for us to think that some queer youth are thriving and other queer youth are facing adversity, and that flourishing is somehow the absence of adversity or discrimination, when in fact, some of these indicators of flourishing are part of one's ability to directly counteract the discrimination that they may also be experiencing at the same time. And here I'd like to give just a bit of an example of how this might come to be for some queer youth, looking at gender sexuality alliances as one setting that could cultivate hope for queer youth. And although some of us might be knowledgeable about GSAs, others might not, essentially GSAs are school-based clubs, and they serve a number of purposes. They provide a space for queer youth and ally youth to come together and socialize, make friends, support one another. They're a place where youth can access information and resources, referrals to queer affirming agencies outside of school. And they're also a space where youth can engage in collective action to counteract discrimination, raise awareness of queer identities and issues that are occurring within their school. And it's quite impressive that in the most recent CDC survey, they found that about 38% of secondary schools in the United States have a GSA or comparable club in them. But of course, this ranges across states. It ranges from 14% in Mississippi all the way up to 72% in Rhode Island. And nevertheless, these are crucial spaces for youth to come together in schools for all of these purposes. In some of the work that my colleagues and I have done, we've looked at how youth may benefit from their involvement in GSAs and how they could have a health promoting effect for GSA members. And what we found that was very powerful was that youth who were more engaged and involved in their GSA over the course of a school year went on to report relative increases in their sense of hope. And we found that it was through that promotion of hope that it predicted relatively lower depressive and anxiety symptoms at the end of the school year. And so here we see this cultivation of hope among queer youth as being fundamental in promoting their health. In stepping back from that and looking at specific indicators of positive development in queer youth, one thing that often is important in our work in thinking about queer identity development is looking at how this fits as part of a normative part of forming one's identity and self-concept through childhood and adolescence. One thing that we've begun to see among contemporary queer youth is an expanding range of identities that youth are generating and taking for themselves. And it's in part why I'm using the term queer in my presentation here as more of an umbrella term, simply because it would be impossible to properly include and name every single identity that has been generated at this point. But this raises a couple of questions as we're using this lens of flourishing and thriving for queer youth. One of the questions that it raises is, how do youth view and continue to add to these identities? How do they develop a shared understanding and recognition of identities? And how do we continue to see them being added? In a sense, I wonder about how this is tied to a greater sense of authenticity for youth, a sense of authenticity for themselves and understanding and coming to a deeper understanding of their identity and having words that can capture that, as well as authenticity in their relationships with others and how they can share that part of themselves in a way that feels more and more authentic. It would also be important in taking this from an intersectional lens to consider how one's sexual orientation identity is also shaped by one's other social identities and social spaces that one occupies, culture, language. These would all be important to consider alongside queer identity development and how young people make greater sense of themselves as a whole person. One part of queer identity development that often is focused on specifically has to do with identity disclosure, or what commonly is referred to as coming out. And while we recognize that coming out is a process that is constantly ongoing, one thing that researchers have often focused on is the age of first disclosure for queer youth. And what we're finding in the research is that this age of first disclosure is happening at younger and younger ages for contemporary queer youth. And so this raises another question of what coming out looks like for contemporary youth. In one way, coming out is necessary when you're developing your identity in a heteronormative and cisnormative world. But if, again, we're taking a positive psychology and positive youth development look at this process, we might ask, what would coming out look like absent heteronormative and cis-sexist norms? And would it be considered as prominent a milestone for queer youth? And again, how do personal attributes and culture shape disclosure and how that looks for some queer youth? Fundamentally, I think this brings us to some questions that begin to look at identity development from a very positive perspective, which is, how would queer youth like to see this process as a part of their lives? We have a lot of data on what it does look like within an oppressive system. How would queer youth like to see that, ideally? And ultimately, how can this process be empowering, meaningful, fulfilling as queer youth grow, both as an individual and as they grow in their relationships with others, whether others are their peers, with adults, with their family members. And at this point, I also want to speak about the need for more action. Some of the questions that I've posed earlier tend to be descriptive in nature, and we need a much richer description of flourishing and thriving among queer youth. And at the same time, we need much more work that can apply that knowledge into translational work in terms of what we're doing with it. And there's certainly a number of approaches that we can take. One could be in the programming that we provide for queer youth, and there are quite a number of topics that we could be addressing around health promotion, healthy relationships with peers, adults, family members, and again, in how we promote a number of those positive developmental outcomes like hope. And this isn't to say that this work isn't already being done. There are a number of studies and programs that have been developed and begun to be evaluated in terms of establishing healthy relationships and psychoeducational programs around that and health promotion. But a common refrain in much of the literature, even the literature that has tested and evaluated existing programs, is that there still exists a need for systematic evaluation of their acceptability, their feasibility, their adaptability and effectiveness for queer youth. We can also think about how we can move to action through programming and policies at the setting level. And within the school context, there is a growing recognition of several policies and practices that are tied to youth's greater sense of well-being and safety within schools. And these include having enumerated anti-discrimination policies within a school or a district, using inclusive curricula where queer identities are visible in that curriculum, having access to competent support and services from school counselors, school nurses, social workers, and having access to an adult mentor in the school. While this is encouraging that there has been empirical support showing that the presence of these policies and practices in schools is connected to queer youth's well-being, we need to dive a bit deeper, and that it's not simply a policy's presence or absence that may be important, but we also need to consider and evaluate policy implementation. And when we consider that from an implementation science framework, we might ask, is a policy understood? Is it supported in terms of financially supported and not simply being an unfunded mandate? Is it supported by administration in terms of validating this policy? And is it followed consistently? If we take into consideration that nuance, we might see the conditions under which a queer affirming policy has the greatest impact for queer youth in schools. We might also, in this process, identify facilitators and barriers to successful implementation of policies. And we would want to ask ourselves, how can certain policies and practices be improved? Perhaps there may be unintended effects from having a policy. And so it's important for us to take that note and be able to modify policies and practices accordingly. And finally, I think it's important for us to recognize that youth are not only affected by their environment, but they take an active role in shaping their environment, and in doing so, shaping their development. We have an incredible amount of research showing how youth resist oppressive policies, and even recently with the anti-queer legislation being enacted in many schools, we see youth resisting that legislation and those policies. We see how queer youth intervene against bias-based harassment and how they can promote affirming norms with their peers. Again, turning to GSAs as one setting within schools where this often occurs, GSAs engage in a number of efforts to raise awareness of discrimination and advocate against it. They might have visual displays within schools, make announcements over the PA system. They may give presentations to other school personnel or to their fellow peers in some of their classes. They also host events throughout the school year, such as Solidarity Week or Trans Day of Remembrance. And a number of GSAs pursue initiatives specific for their schools, such as having gender-neutral bathrooms or gender-neutral graduation gowns that are affirming for queer students. What we found, again, in some of our work on GSAs is that GSA engagement actually does predict increased advocacy among members over the course of the school year. And crucially, finding that engaging in that advocacy actually then predicts increased socio-political efficacy among GSA members or their sense of ability to promote social justice. We also find that this extends beyond the GSA itself to show that GSA advocacy can potentially benefit individuals within the larger school context. And in a recent study, we found that greater GSA advocacy attenuates sexual orientation-based depression disparities at the school year's end. And so that in schools students in schools whose GSAs had engaged in more advocacy, we see that this disparity is smaller at the end. And so with this knowledge that youth advocacy is central in achieving queer youth flourishing, we might have several remaining questions that I'll pose. One is, given that there is a range of advocacy efforts that queer youth engage in, we might ask, what are some common and essential elements that underlie their success? It's important for us to consider this because we also know that advocacy can bring challenges, that we can face setbacks in that process of engaging in advocacy, and can raise other stressors, especially for queer youth who are navigating identity disclosure, while at the same time recognizing that advocacy can sometimes be a very public act. And so as we are working with youth, as youth are engaging in advocacy, we might ask ourselves this question so that we can provide relevant and important support through that process. We might also ask what efforts have larger, immediate and/or lasting effects, or even delayed effects where we might not see the benefits immediately, but that they eventually are shown over time. And finally, I would end by asking, how do youth from different backgrounds work in solidarity with one another to counteract multiple systems of oppression and to promote one another's thriving? So I'll pause there. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Paul, for that very interesting talk. For those who have questions, please put them in the chat. There's a question here from Debbie Ribas-Drake, who says, thank you so much for this talk. To what do you attribute the trend that youth are coming out at younger ages? And is this trend similar across ethnic racial groups?
I think there are probably a number of contributing factors. I think one of the largest would be that queer youth are finding more affirming spaces where it may be a GSA, it may be in a youth organization, it may be in a virtual space, and feeling affirmed, feeling supported allows young people to be able to be authentic and to share authentic with themselves and feel free to be able to pursue this and to also be able to be authentic with other people in their lives earlier.
Thank you.
To the second point, I think that's something that we need to give a little bit more careful consideration to in terms of how we might see different developmental patterns and trajectories within the queer community. One of those lines being around race and ethnicity. I don't think that there's enough work to be able to say definitively that there are distinct patterns. I think it's a bit mixed with what existing research has found. But again, I think it would be important for us to attend to that in the spirit of ensuring that youth from many different backgrounds feel equally supported in developing this part of their identity and that we have resources and supports available for them through that.
Thank you, Paul. Our mutual friend Adam Hoffman writes, I think GSAs are a wonderful opportunity for queer students to have space where they can find safety and community and to learn about their identities. Are there recommended or best practice activities that happen in GSA organizations? For example, I wonder if there's guidance given to leaders of GSAs to promote positive identity development and means of coping to discrimination.
That's a great question. I know that GLSEN, for one, has some materials available on their website, glsen.org. And for GSAs, for youth who are interested in starting a GSA at their school or having ideas of some activities to do within their GSA. I think that one of the challenges that still exist is that there are many ideas for what GSAs can do and activities that they can complete, but there often are not accompanying guides for doing them. And many times this is where we see GSA advisors having a pivotal role because some of these activities and events are annual and reoccurring. And so the advisor has that historical knowledge of how an activity or event may have been done in the past and what were some of the lessons learned from that and how they can improve upon it for next year. But I think that that's something that's needed is the development of materials and programming that's tailored for GSAs and ensuring that it's representative and inclusive because GSAs are themselves quite diverse. So I think that that's where a great deal of research will be headed in the future.
Thank you, Paul.